The morning sun cast long shadows across the marble corridors of Buckingham Palace as Queen Camilla made her way through the private royal quarters. Her footsteps echoed softly against the polished floors, the only sound breaking the early morning silence that enveloped the ancient walls. She moved with purpose, her silk morning dress rustling gently as she navigated the familiar passages that had become her domain since ascending to her role as queen consort. In her hands she carried a small, ornate jewelry case, made of deep mahogany, with gold clasps that gleamed in the filtered sunlight streaming through the tall windows. The case felt heavier than its actual weight, burdened not just with precious stones and metals, but with the weight of history, memory, and controversy that had followed these particular pieces for decades. The sapphire set within the case had once belonged to Princess Diana, the beloved people's princess whose tragic death had left an indelible mark on the British monarchy and the hearts of millions around the world. The stunning collection consisted of a magnificent necklace featuring a central sapphire surrounded by diamonds, matching earrings that caught light like captured starlight, a delicate bracelet that had graced Diana's wrist at countless royal events, and a breathtaking ring that had become one of the most recognizable pieces of jewelry in modern royal history. Camilla's fingers tightened around the case as she remembered the conversation that had taken place the evening before. King Charles had been in his study, reviewing state papers when she had approached him about the jewelry. The discussion had been carefully orchestrated, her words chosen with diplomatic precision as she explained her desire to wear Diana's sapphire set to the upcoming state dinner honoring the visiting Danish royalty. The request had not been made lightly. Camilla understood the sensitivity surrounding anything that had belonged to Diana, particularly jewelry that held such public recognition and emotional significance. However, she had reasoned with Charles that as queen consort, it was appropriate for her to wear pieces from the crown's collection, especially for such important state occasions. The sapphire set, she argued, would complement her planned evening gown perfectly and demonstrate the continuity of the monarchy. Charles had listened in contemplative silence, his weathered hands folded before him as he considered the implications of her request. The king was acutely aware of the delicate balance required when it came to Diana's legacy. Even decades after her death, public sentiment remained strong, and any perceived slight or inappropriate handling of her memory could spark controversy that would reflect poorly on the institution they served. After what felt like an eternity of consideration, Charles had given his consent. The jewelry would be temporarily removed from its secure location in the royal vault and prepared for Camilla's use at the state dinner. However, he had emphasized that the arrangement was strictly temporary and that the pieces must be returned to their designated storage immediately following the event. Now, as Camilla made her way toward the palace's main entrance, where her car waited to transport her to a private appointment, the jewelry case remained in her possession. She had intended to have the pieces professionally cleaned and inspected before the evening's festivities, a common practice with such valuable and historically significant items. Her personal jeweler, a discreet and trusted craftsman who had served the royal family for over 2 decades, waited at his Mayfair establishment to provide these services. The palace around her hummed with its usual morning activity. Staff members moved efficiently through the corridors, preparing for another day of royal duties and obligations. Maids attended to the countless details required to maintain the grandeur of the residence, while security personnel conducted their routine checks and patrols. The kitchen staff had already begun preparations for the day's meals, and the administrative offices buzzed with the correspondence and scheduling that kept the monarchy functioning smoothly. Camilla nodded graciously to the staff members she encountered, acknowledging their respectful bows and curtsies with the practiced ease of someone who had spent years learning the intricate protocols of royal life. Her transformation from the controversial figure she had once been to the respected queen consort she had become had been gradual but complete, marked by years of dedicated service and careful attention to her public role. As she approached the main entrance hall, its soaring ceiling decorated with elaborate frescoes and crystal chandeliers that had witnessed centuries of royal history, Camilla could see her car waiting in the courtyard beyond. The Bentley gleamed in the morning sunlight, its royal standard flying proudly from the hood, while her personal protection officers stood at attention nearby. She was mentally reviewing her schedule for the day when a voice called out behind her, firm and respectful, but unmistakably commanding in its tone. The sound caused her to pause mid-step, her hand instinctively tightening on the jewelry case as she turned to identify the speaker. Captain James Whitmore stood at attention in the corridor behind her, his red ceremonial uniform immaculate, and his bearing reflecting the decades of military service that had brought him to his current position as one of the palace's most senior guards. His face bore the weathered lines of a career soldier, and his eyes held the steady gaze of someone accustomed to making difficult decisions under pressure. "Your Majesty," he said, his voice carrying the crisp authority of his military background while maintaining the deference required when addressing royalty. "I must respectfully request that you halt your departure." Camilla turned fully to face him, her expression shifting from mild curiosity to something approaching surprise. In all her years within the royal household, she had rarely been directly challenged by palace staff, and certainly not by a guard who was supposed to facilitate her movements rather than impede them. "Captain Whitmore," she replied, her voice maintaining its regal composure despite the unexpected interruption. "I'm afraid I don't understand. I have an appointment that requires my immediate departure." The guard took a measured step forward, his posture remaining respectfully formal while his expression conveyed unwavering determination. Years of service had taught him to navigate the complex hierarchies and protocols of royal life, but they had also instilled in him an unshakable commitment to his duties, regardless of personal consequences. "Ma'am, I have received explicit instructions regarding the jewelry case in your possession," he continued, his words carefully chosen to maintain propriety while asserting his authority. "I'm afraid I cannot permit you to leave the palace with those items at this time." The words hung in the air between them like a challenge, creating a tension that seemed to electrify the normally serene atmosphere of the entrance hall. Several nearby staff members had noticed the unusual exchange, their movements slowing as they attempted to appear busy while straining to overhear the conversation between the queen consort and the guard. Camilla's mind raced as she processed the implications of the captain's words. Who could have issued such instructions? Charles had given his explicit permission the previous evening, and she was unaware of any subsequent changes to that authorization. The confusion was compounded by the public nature of the confrontation, taking place as it was in one of the palace's most visible areas where staff members and visitors regularly passed. "I believe there has been some misunderstanding," she said, her voice taking on a slightly sharper edge, while still maintaining the controlled tone expected of royalty. "His Majesty the King has personally authorized my temporary custody of these items. Perhaps you should verify your information before making such accusations." Captain Whitmore's expression remained unchanged, though those familiar with military bearing might have detected a slight tightening around his eyes that suggested the strain of the situation. He had been dreading this moment since receiving his orders earlier that morning, knowing full well the delicate position it would place him in. However, his commitment to duty outweighed his personal comfort. "Your Majesty, I understand your position," he replied with measured respect. "However, my instructions come from the highest authority and are quite specific. The Diana Memorial Collection, of which the Sapphire set forms a central part, is not to leave the palace grounds under any circumstances without explicit written authorization from the Crown Estate's Board of Trustees." The mention of the Diana Memorial Collection sent a chill through the air that was almost palpable. This was not simply about jewelry or protocol. It was about the careful preservation of Diana's legacy and the complex emotions that still surrounded her memory within the royal family and the broader public consciousness. Camilla felt her composure being tested in a way she had not experienced since the early days of her relationship with Charles, when every public appearance had been scrutinized and every action dissected by media and public alike. The jewelry case in her hands seemed to grow heavier as the weight of the situation settled upon her. "Captain," she said, her voice dropping to a lower register that carried both authority and warning, "I am the queen consort of this realm. Are you seriously suggesting that I am attempting to steal jewelry from the crown's collection?" The accusation, even implied rather than stated directly, created an immediate shift in the dynamics of their confrontation. The few staff members within earshot had stopped all pretense of their duties and were now openly watching the unprecedented scene unfold before them. In the long history of Buckingham Palace, few could remember a similar public challenge to royal authority by palace staff. Captain Whitmore maintained his military bearing, but the strain of his position was becoming increasingly evident. His loyalty to the institution he served was absolute, but the current situation required him to balance competing authorities and navigate waters for which his military training had not fully prepared him. "Ma'am, I would never presume to make such an accusation," he replied carefully. "However, my duty requires me to ensure that all protocols regarding the Diana Memorial Collection are strictly observed. The Board of Trustees has implemented these procedures to protect both the integrity of the collection and the monarchy's reputation. The invocation of the Board of Trustees added another layer of complexity to the situation. This governing body, established in the wake of Diana's death to oversee the preservation and appropriate use of her personal effects, had become a powerful entity within the royal household structure. Their authority in matters relating to Diana's legacy was considerable and had been designed to prevent exactly the kind of controversy that improper handling of her belongings might create. As the confrontation continued, other figures began to appear in the entrance hall. Word of the unusual standoff had begun to spread through the palace's efficient communication networks, and senior staff members were arriving to assess the situation and determine appropriate responses. Lady Margaret Thornton, the Queen Consort's private secretary, hurried into the hall with an expression of barely controlled alarm. Her decades of service to the royal family had taught her to anticipate and prevent exactly these kinds of public confrontations, and the current situation represented a significant failure of the careful protocols she had spent years establishing. Behind her came Sir Robert Hamilton, the palace's deputy private secretary, whose responsibilities included liaison with various royal collections and their governing bodies. His presence suggested that the matter had already escalated beyond a simple misunderstanding between Camilla and a guard. The arrival of these additional figures transformed what had begun as a private confrontation into something approaching a crisis meeting in the middle of the palace's main thoroughfare. The implications for royal protocol and public relations were enormous, and each participant understood that their actions in the coming minutes would have consequences far beyond the immediate moment. Camilla found herself at the center of a situation that threatened to undermine her carefully cultivated position within the royal family. The jewelry case in her hands had become a symbol of much larger issues surrounding her role, her relationship to Diana's legacy, and the complex dynamics that continued to shape the modern monarchy. The morning sun continued to stream through the palace windows, but the atmosphere in the entrance hall had grown decidedly cooler. What should have been a simple departure for a routine appointment had transformed into a confrontation that would test relationships, protocols, and loyalties that had been years in the making. Captain Whitmore remained at attention, his duty clear even as the situation around him grew increasingly complex. The jewelry case that had seemed so innocent in Camilla's hands now represented a flashpoint for tensions that had long simmered beneath the surface of royal life. As more figures gathered in the hall and the confrontation showed no signs of immediate resolution, it became clear that this was not simply about jewelry or protocol. It was about power, legacy, and the ongoing challenge of balancing respect for the past with the needs of the present within an institution that had survived for over a millennium by adapting to changing circumstances while maintaining its essential character. The stage was set for a confrontation that would test everyone involved and potentially reshape the delicate balance of authority and respect that kept the modern monarchy functioning in an increasingly complex world. The tension in the entrance hall continued to thicken as Lady Margaret Thornton approached the group with measured steps, her years of diplomatic training evident in every carefully controlled movement. As Camilla's private secretary, she understood better than anyone the delicate nature of the situation and the potential ramifications that could ripple outward from this confrontation. "Your Majesty," Lady Thornton said with a respectful curtsy, her voice carrying the calm authority that had made her invaluable to the royal household. "Perhaps we might resolve this matter more privately? I'm certain there's been some miscommunication that can be easily clarified." But Captain Whitmore remained unmoved, his military bearing as rigid as ever. "Lady Thornton, with respect, this is not a matter of miscommunication. The protocols regarding the Diana Memorial Collection are quite clear, and they supersede all other considerations." Sir Robert Hamilton stepped forward, his face bearing the grave expression of someone who understood the full implications of what was unfolding. As Deputy Private Secretary with specific responsibilities for royal collections, he had been intimately involved in the creation of the protocols now being invoked. "Captain Whitmore," Sir Robert said, his voice carrying the weight of institutional authority, I must point out that Her Majesty the Queen Consort operates under different protocols than other members of the household. Perhaps we should review the specific authorizations in place. The guard's eyes never wavered from their fixed position. Sir Robert, I'm aware of the various protocols. However, the Diana Memorial Collection operates under its own governance structure, established by royal decree following the princess's death. These protocols were designed to prevent any controversy or misunderstanding regarding the use of her personal effects. Camilla listened to this exchange with growing frustration, feeling increasingly like a bystander in a discussion about her own actions and authority. The jewelry case in her hands had become the focal point of what was rapidly evolving into a complex institutional dispute. "Gentlemen," she interjected, her voice cutting through their diplomatic back and forth with royal authority, "I find myself in the remarkable position of being lectured about protocols in my own palace. Perhaps someone could explain exactly who has the authority to countermand the king's explicit permission." The question struck at the heart of the constitutional complexity that made the situation so delicate. The British monarchy operated on layers of tradition, law, and established practice that sometimes created conflicting lines of authority. The Diana Memorial Collection represented one such complexity, established with its own governance structure that had been designed to operate somewhat independently of normal royal protocols. Sir Robert cleared his throat diplomatically. "Your Majesty, the Diana Memorial Collection was established under special provisions following extensive consultation with legal experts and constitutional scholars. The intent was to create a framework that would protect the integrity of the princess's legacy while respecting the broader needs of the monarchy. What Sir Robert is diplomatically avoiding," Captain Whitmore added with military directness, "is that the collection's governance structure was specifically designed to prevent exactly this type of situation. The Board of Trustees includes representatives from Diana's family, the royal household, and independent experts. Their authority in matters relating to her personal effects is considerable." Lady Thornton shifted uncomfortably, recognizing that the situation was spiraling beyond her ability to manage through normal diplomatic channels. "Captain, surely there must be emergency provisions for situations like this?" "Her Majesty has a legitimate need for these items tonight. There are provisions for emergency access," the guard confirmed, "but they require unanimous consent from available board members and documentation of the specific necessity. The standard protocol calls for at least 72 hours' notice for any removal of items from the collection." Camilla felt her patience reaching its limit. The bureaucratic complexity being described seemed almost designed to humiliate her, creating barriers and requirements that effectively treated her like any other member of the public seeking access to museum pieces. "This is absolutely ridiculous," she said, her composure beginning to crack. "These are not museum artifacts. They are part of the Crown's jewelry collection, and I am the Queen Consort. The suggestion that I need permission from a committee to wear jewelry to a state dinner is beyond absurd." The declaration hung in the air with considerable force, and for a moment it seemed as though royal authority might simply override the complex protocols that had been established. However, Captain Whitmore's response demonstrated the depth of institutional commitment to the Diana Memorial Collection's independence. "Your Majesty, with the greatest respect, that is precisely the point that the collection's governance structure was designed to address. These pieces are not simply jewelry. They are tangible connections to Princess Diana's memory and legacy. The board's authority exists to ensure that their use never becomes a source of controversy or public relations difficulty for the monarchy." The implicit criticism in his words was unmistakable. The suggestion that Camilla's use of Diana's jewelry might create controversy struck at long-standing public sensitivities about her role within the royal family and her relationship to Diana's memory. Sir Robert attempted to diffuse the growing tension. "Perhaps we could contact the board members who are currently available and request an emergency consultation. Given the importance of tonight's state dinner, there might be flexibility in the normal procedures." "The Danish delegation arrives in 6 hours," Lady Thornton added urgently. "Her Majesty's preparation schedule is already quite compressed. We cannot afford significant delays." But Captain Whitmore's expression suggested that he viewed such practical concerns as secondary to his primary responsibility. "The board's procedures exist for sound reasons. Princess Diana's jewelry has become some of the most recognizable and emotionally charged pieces in the royal collection. Any improper handling could create exactly the kind of public relations crisis that the monarchy can ill afford. Meanwhile, word of the confrontation was spreading throughout the palace. With the efficiency that characterized royal household communications, senior staff members who had been attending to their morning duties found their attention drawn to the unprecedented situation developing in the entrance hall. Mrs. Eleanor Fitzpatrick, the palace's head housekeeper, appeared at the edge of the gathering with an expression of deep concern. Her responsibilities included oversight of the royal family's personal effects, and she understood better than most the protocols surrounding Diana's collection. "Begging your pardon," she said with a respectful curtsy, "but perhaps I could offer some clarification. The Sapphire set was indeed removed from storage yesterday evening on His Majesty's authority. However, the paperwork indicated that the items were for temporary display in Her Majesty's private quarters, not for removal from the palace." This revelation added a new dimension to the confrontation. The suggestion that there had been a misunderstanding about the scope of Charles's authorization created the possibility that both sides were operating under incorrect assumptions. Camilla's expression sharpened. "Mrs. Saxio, Fitzpatrick, are you suggesting that my understanding of the king's permission was somehow incomplete?" The housekeeper maintained her deferential posture, while clearly uncomfortable with being drawn into the dispute. "Your Majesty, I only know what the paperwork specified. Perhaps there was additional verbal authorization that wasn't documented." Sir Robert seized upon this potential avenue for resolution. "If there's uncertainty about the specific terms of His Majesty's authorization, perhaps we should seek clarification directly from the king?" However, this suggestion created its own complications. Charles was currently in a private meeting with the Prime Minister, discussing matters of state that couldn't easily be interrupted. Moreover, the idea of having to seek royal permission for permission struck many in the gathering as an unprecedented breach of normal protocol. Captain Whitmore remained unmoved by these developments. Regardless of any confusion about authorization, the fundamental issue remains unchanged. The Diana Memorial Collection protocols are quite specific about removal of items from palace grounds. Without proper board approval, I cannot permit these items to leave. The standoff had now been ongoing for nearly 20 minutes, and the number of palace staff members aware of the situation continued to grow. The entrance hall, normally a place of dignified royal activity, had become the site of an institutional crisis that threatened to expose deep-seated tensions within the modern monarchy. Camilla found herself facing a choice that would define not only this immediate situation, but potentially her broader relationship with royal protocol and Diana's enduring legacy. The jewelry case in her hands represented more than precious stones and metals. It had become a symbol of competing authorities and the complex balance of power within the royal household. Lady Thornton attempted another diplomatic intervention. "Your Majesty, perhaps we could arrange for the jewelry to be transported under guard to your appointment? This would address the captain's security concerns while allowing your schedule to proceed." But Captain Whitmore shook his head firmly. "The protocols are not primarily about security, Lady Thornton. They concern the appropriate use and handling of items that hold enormous symbolic value for the British public. Any deviation from established procedures risks creating exactly the kind of controversy that the governance structure was designed to prevent." The implications of his words were clear to everyone present. The suggestion that Camilla's use of Diana's jewelry might be controversial touched on sensitive public perceptions that had taken years to navigate successfully. Sir Robert attempted a different approach. "Captain, surely the protocols allow for some discretionary authority in exceptional circumstances? Tonight's state dinner is hardly a routine social event. The protocol specifically anticipates state functions," the guard replied. "That's precisely why they require advance planning and board approval. The public visibility of such events makes proper authorization even more critical." As the confrontation continued, it became increasingly clear that this was not simply about following rules or maintaining security. The deeper issue concerned the ongoing challenge of balancing respect for Diana's memory with the practical needs of the current royal family. The Diana Memorial Collection had been established during a period of intense public mourning and scrutiny, when every decision regarding her legacy carried enormous emotional and political weight. The governance structure that now governed her personal effects reflected the complex emotions and competing interests that had surrounded those early decisions. Camilla understood that her position as queen consort placed her in a unique relationship to this legacy. As Charles's wife, she had inherited not only the privileges of royal status, but also the complex responsibilities and sensitivities that came with that role. The jewelry in her hands represented one of the most visible and emotionally charged aspects of that inheritance. The morning sun continued to stream through the palace windows, but the atmosphere in the entrance hall had grown increasingly charged with institutional tension. What had begun as a simple departure for a routine appointment had evolved into a confrontation that would test the very foundations of royal authority and protocol. Captain Whitmore maintained his position with unwavering determination, his military training and institutional loyalty providing him with the resolve necessary to challenge royal authority when he believed his duty required it. The situation demanded a resolution, but the competing authorities and complex emotions involved made any simple solution increasingly unlikely. The stage was set for a confrontation that would ultimately require someone to choose between competing loyalties, institutional authorities, and personal relationships that had been carefully cultivated over years of royal service. The atmosphere in the entrance hall had become electric with tension, as more palace officials continued to arrive, drawn by reports of the unprecedented confrontation. Among the newcomers was Lord Pemberton, the Lord Chamberlain, whose arrival signaled that the matter had escalated to the highest levels of palace administration. His presence commanded immediate attention from everyone in the hall. Lord Pemberton surveyed the scene with the practiced eye of someone who had spent decades navigating royal crises. His weathered face bore the gravitas that came with being responsible for the overall functioning of the royal household, and his arrival suggested that normal diplomatic channels had failed to resolve the situation. "Captain Whitmore," he said, his voice carrying the authority of his position while maintaining the courtesy required in royal settings. "I believe we need to discuss the situation developing here." The guard came to even more rigid attention, if such a thing were possible. "Lord Chamberlain, I am executing my duties according to established protocols regarding the Diana Memorial Collection." "Yes, I've been briefed on your interpretation of those protocols," Lord Pemberton replied carefully. "However, I think we need to consider the broader implications of this situation." Camilla watched this exchange with growing frustration, feeling increasingly marginalized in a discussion about her own actions and authority. The jewelry case in her hands had become the center of an institutional power struggle that seemed to have forgotten the human element at its core. "Lord Pemberton," she interjected with controlled authority, "I find myself in the extraordinary position of being detained in my own residence by palace staff. Perhaps you could explain how we've reached this point?" The Lord Chamberlain turned to face her with the respectful bearing that protocol demanded, but his expression suggested the considerable complexity of the situation he was being asked to navigate. "Your Majesty, the matter involves competing authorities and protocols that were established under extraordinary circumstances. The Diana Memorial Collection operates under governance structures that were created with the best intentions, but have created some unexpected complexities." Behind the diplomatic language, Camilla could hear the acknowledgement that the current situation represented a failure of institutional planning. The protocols designed to protect Diana's legacy had created a bureaucratic structure that could potentially undermine royal authority in situations like this. Sir Robert stepped forward with documents that he had retrieved during the ongoing discussions. "Lord Chamberlain, I've reviewed the original establishing documents for the Diana Memorial Collection. The governance structure does indeed provide considerable autonomy to the Board of Trustees. However," Lady Thornton added quickly, "surely there must be provisions for situations involving the immediate royal family? The idea that the Queen Consort would be subject to the same restrictions as members of the general public seems constitutionally problematic." Lord Pemberton nodded thoughtfully. "The constitutional questions are indeed complex. The Diana Memorial Collection was established during a period of intense public scrutiny when protecting her legacy took precedence over other considerations. The current situation suggests that some of those decisions may need to be revisited." Captain Whitmore maintained his rigid posture but spoke with obvious concern about the direction of the conversation. "Lord Chamberlain, the protocols exist for sound reasons. Any modification of the collection's governance structure would require extensive consultation and approval from all stakeholders, including Diana's family," Sir Robert noted quietly, adding another layer of complexity to any potential resolution. The mention of Diana's family introduced an additional dimension that everyone present understood but had been reluctant to address directly. The Spencer family had been deeply involved in establishing the Memorial Collection's governance structure, and any changes would require their consent and cooperation. Mrs. Fitzpatrick, who had remained quietly observant during the recent exchanges, stepped forward with additional information that she felt might be relevant to the discussion. "Lord Chamberlain, if I may," she said with appropriate deference, "there have been previous instances where the collection's protocols created similar difficulties. Last year, when Prince William requested access to his mother's personal correspondence for the 20th anniversary commemoration, the process required several weeks of board consultation. This revelation highlighted the extent to which the collection's governance structure had created bureaucratic barriers, even for Diana's own children. The implications for the broader royal family's access to items that were technically part of the crown's holdings were considerable. Camilla felt her patience finally reaching its breaking point. The suggestion that she was being held to the same standards as museum visitors seeking access to historical artifacts struck her as fundamentally inconsistent with her position and responsibilities. "This is absolutely absurd," she declared, her royal composure finally giving way to genuine frustration. "I am the Queen Consort of the United Kingdom. The suggestion that I need committee approval to wear jewelry to represent the crown at a state dinner is beyond ridiculous." The force of her declaration created a moment of silence in the hall, as everyone present absorbed the implications of her direct challenge to the established system. The jewelry case in her hands had become a symbol of much larger questions about authority, tradition, and the balance of power within the modern monarchy. Lord Pemberton recognized that the situation had reached a critical juncture, requiring immediate action. The continued public nature of the confrontation posed significant risks to the monarchy's reputation and the careful relationships that kept the institution functioning smoothly. "Your Majesty," he said with diplomatic precision, "perhaps we could continue this discussion in more private surroundings. The entrance hall is hardly the appropriate venue for resolving complex constitutional questions." But Camilla's frustration had reached a point where diplomatic niceties no longer seemed adequate to address the fundamental issues at stake. "Lord Pemberton, we are well beyond questions of appropriate venues. I am being prevented from leaving my own residence by staff members citing bureaucratic procedures that appear designed to humiliate the Queen Consort." Captain Whitmore remained unmoved by the escalating rhetoric, his military training providing him with the emotional distance necessary to maintain his position despite the considerable pressure being applied. "Your Majesty, the protocols are not intended to humiliate anyone. They exist to protect the integrity of Princess Diana's legacy and to prevent the monarchy from facing unnecessary controversy." The implicit suggestion that Camilla's use of Diana's jewelry might create controversy struck at the heart of long-standing public sensitivities. Despite years of careful cultivation of her public image and genuine service to the crown, there remained underlying tensions about her relationship to Diana's memory. Lady Thornton attempted to diffuse the increasingly personal nature of the confrontation. "Captain Whitmore, surely we can acknowledge that Her Majesty's intentions are entirely appropriate. This is not a case of casual use, but rather a state function requiring suitable representation." "The intentions are not in question," the guard replied carefully. "However, the protocols exist precisely because good intentions are not sufficient protection against public misunderstanding or media manipulation." Sir Robert consulted his documents again, searching for any provision that might offer a path toward resolution. "There is a clause allowing for emergency board consultation via telephone conference. Given the time constraints, perhaps we could arrange such a consultation within the next hour." This suggestion offered the first real hope for a practical solution to the standoff. However, it also required acknowledgement from Camilla that the board's authority was legitimate and that she would abide by their decision. Lord Pemberton seized upon this potential avenue for resolution. "Your Majesty, would you be willing to participate in such a consultation? It would allow for proper consideration of the situation while respecting the established governance structure." The proposal placed Camilla in a difficult position. Agreeing to the consultation would implicitly acknowledge the board's authority over her actions, potentially setting a precedent for future situations. However, refusing would likely prolong the confrontation and risk creating the very public controversy that everyone was trying to avoid. Meanwhile, the clock continued to tick toward the evening state dinner. The Danish delegation would arrive in less than 5 hours, and Camilla's preparation schedule was becoming increasingly compressed. The practical implications of the delay were adding additional pressure to an already complex situation. Mrs. Fitzpatrick, understanding the domestic logistics involved, provided an updated assessment of the timeline. Your Majesty, if the consultation could be completed within the next 90 minutes, there would still be sufficient time for the jewelry cleaning and your personal preparation schedule. The practical considerations were becoming as important as the constitutional questions. The state dinner represented a significant diplomatic occasion that required proper preparation and attention to detail. Any compromise of the evening's success would reflect poorly on the monarchy's ability to fulfill its ceremonial and diplomatic functions. Captain Whitmore maintained his position while acknowledging the time pressures involved. The emergency consultation process is designed to be completed within 60 to 90 minutes, depending on the availability of board members. However, I must emphasize that the process requires genuine consideration of all perspectives, not merely rubber stamping a predetermined outcome. His words carried a warning that the board's independence would be maintained regardless of the pressure being applied for a favorable decision. The Diana Memorial Collection's governance structure had been designed to resist exactly the kind of royal influence that might compromise its integrity. Lord Pemberton recognized that the situation required a decision that would balance competing authorities while maintaining the monarchy's dignity and effectiveness. The precedent set by the current confrontation would influence future interactions between royal authority and institutional governance structures. Very well, he announced with the authority of his position. I propose that we arrange for an emergency board consultation within the next hour. Her Majesty will have the opportunity to present her case directly to the board members, and they will make their determination based on the full circumstances. This proposal represented a compromise that acknowledged both Camilla's position and the board's authority. However, it also meant that the Queen Consort would be required to justify her actions to a committee, a situation unprecedented in recent royal history. Camilla considered the proposal carefully, weighing the implications of various possible responses. The jewelry case in her hands represented more than access to beautiful objects. It had become a test of her authority and position within the complex structure of the modern monarchy. The entrance hall remained filled with tension as everyone awaited her decision. The confrontation had evolved far beyond its original parameters to become a defining moment in the relationship between royal authority and institutional governance. The resolution would establish precedents that would influence the monarchy's operation for years to come. The morning sun continued to stream through the palace windows, but the shadows in the hall seemed to have grown longer as the weight of institutional crisis settled over everyone present. The stage was set for a decision that would test the very foundations of royal authority and constitutional balance within one of the world's oldest continuing monarchies. The weight of the decision hung heavily in the air as Camilla considered Lord Pemberton's proposal. The emergency board consultation represented both a potential solution and a fundamental challenge to her understanding of her role as Queen Consort. The jewelry case in her hands had become the symbol of a much larger constitutional question that would set precedents for generations to come. Very well, she finally said, her voice carrying a mixture of resignation and determination. I will participate in this consultation. However, I want it clearly understood that I view this entire situation as an unprecedented breach of normal royal protocol. Lord Pemberton nodded with diplomatic relief. Your Majesty, the consultation will be conducted with the full dignity and respect appropriate to your position. I will personally ensure that the board members understand the exceptional nature of the circumstances. The decision to proceed with the consultation triggered immediate activity throughout the palace as staff members began implementing the complex logistics required to arrange an emergency board meeting. Sir Robert took responsibility for contacting the available trustees, while Lady Thornton worked to modify Camilla's schedule to accommodate the unexpected delay. Captain Whitmore finally allowed himself a slight relaxation of his rigid posture, though he remained vigilant about his responsibilities regarding the jewelry. Your Majesty, I will ensure that the collection items remain secure during the consultation process. The phrase collection items rather than jewelry highlighted the ongoing tension about how Diana's personal effects should be characterized and treated. To Camilla, these were pieces of royal jewelry that should be available for appropriate state occasions. To the Memorial Collection's governance structure, they were irreplaceable artifacts, requiring careful protection and controlled access. As the palace staff dispersed to handle their various responsibilities, Camilla found herself escorted to the blue drawing room. a private space where the consultation could be conducted with appropriate dignity. The room's elegant furnishings and portraits of past monarchs provided a suitably formal setting for what had become an extraordinary constitutional moment. Lady Thornton accompanied her, carrying additional files and documentation that might be relevant to the board's deliberations. Her expression reflected the stress of managing a situation that had no clear precedents in royal protocol or constitutional law. "Your Majesty," she said as they settled into the drawing room, "I've prepared a summary of your official schedule and the diplomatic importance of tonight's state dinner." The board should understand that this is not a casual social event, but a significant ceremonial obligation. Meanwhile, Sir Robert had succeeded in reaching 3 of the 5 board members who comprised the Diana Memorial Collection's governing body. The 4th member was traveling internationally and could not be reached, while the 5th was dealing with a family emergency that prevented participation. The 3 available members represented different perspectives on the collection's purpose and governance. Professor Margaret Ashworth, a constitutional historian from Oxford, brought academic expertise about royal protocol and precedent. Lord Spencer, Diana's brother, provided family perspective and deep personal investment in protecting his sister's legacy. Dr. Sarah Mitchell, a museum curator specializing in royal collections, offered professional expertise about the preservation and appropriate use of historical artifacts. The technological arrangements for the consultation proved complex, as the board members were located in different parts of the country. A secure video conference system was hastily established, with additional telephone connections to ensure clear communication throughout the discussion. As these preparations continued, word of the unusual situation began to spread beyond the palace walls. The Royal Press Corps, always alert to unusual activity within the monarchy, had noticed the extended delay in Camilla's scheduled departure and the unusual number of senior officials moving through the palace corridors. Rebecca Harrison, a veteran royal correspondent for the Times, had positioned herself strategically near the palace gates and was beginning to piece together indications that something significant was developing within the royal household. Her sources within the palace staff had provided hints about an unusual confrontation involving the queen consort, though the specific details remained unclear. Inside the palace, the consultation preparations were nearing completion. The blue drawing room had been equipped with the necessary technology for the video conference, and security protocols had been established to ensure the privacy and confidentiality of the discussion. Lord Pemberton took responsibility for facilitating the consultation, his role as Lord Chamberlain providing him with the authority and diplomatic skill necessary to manage such a delicate situation. His opening remarks would need to balance respect for all parties while clearly presenting the complex circumstances that had led to the emergency meeting. At precisely 11 o'clock, the consultation began with the 3 board members appearing on screen from their respective locations. The formal nature of the proceedings was emphasized by the careful attention to protocol and procedure that characterized all aspects of royal business. Distinguished members of the Diana Memorial Collection Board, Lord Pemberton began with appropriate ceremony, "We are convening this emergency consultation to address an urgent situation regarding access to items within the collection. Her Majesty Queen Camilla is present and will speak to the specific circumstances involved." Professor Ashworth appeared on screen from her Oxford office, her academic demeanor bringing scholarly gravity to the proceedings. "Lord Chamberlain, we understand the urgency of the situation. However, I trust you appreciate that the board's responsibilities require careful consideration of all implications." Lord Spencer's image showed him in what appeared to be his private study, surrounded by family photographs that included several of Diana. His presence in the consultation carried emotional weight that all participants recognized, but few felt comfortable addressing directly. "Lord Pemberton," he said with quiet authority, "the governance structure for my sister's collection was established with great care and considerable legal consultation. Any deviation from established procedures requires compelling justification." Dr. Mitchell joined from her museum office, her professional environment reinforcing her expertise in the preservation and appropriate use of historical artifacts. "I agree with Lord Spencer about the importance of maintaining proper procedures. The collection's integrity depends on consistent application of our established protocols. Camilla listened to these opening statements with growing awareness of the formidable challenge she faced. The board members were clearly committed to protecting the collection's independence and would not be easily swayed by arguments based purely on royal authority or practical convenience. When invited to present her case, she chose her words carefully, understanding that the precedent established by this consultation would influence future situations involving the royal family and Diana's legacy. Distinguished board members, she began with formal courtesy. I approach this consultation with great respect for your responsibilities and the important work you do in preserving Princess Diana's legacy. However, I believe the current situation represents an unprecedented interpretation of the collection's governance that creates unnecessary conflict with legitimate royal duties. She proceeded to outline the circumstances leading to her request for the jewelry, emphasizing the formal nature of the state dinner and the diplomatic importance of proper ceremonial presentation. Her argument focused on the appropriate use of royal regalia for state occasions rather than personal or social purposes. Professor Ashworth responded with scholarly precision. Your Majesty, while we acknowledge the importance of tonight's state dinner, the collection's protocols specifically address high-profile public events. The visibility of such occasions actually strengthens the case for careful advance planning rather than emergency authorizations. Lord Spencer's contribution carried the personal weight of family connection. Your Majesty, I hope you understand that these protocols exist not to create difficulties, but to ensure that my sister's memory is treated with appropriate care and respect. The public's emotional connection to these items requires that their use be handled with extraordinary sensitivity. Dr. Mitchell added professional perspective about the practical implications of the request. The Sapphire set represents some of the most recognizable pieces in the entire collection. Their public appearance always generates significant media attention and public commentary. This visibility makes proper authorization procedures even more critical. The board members' responses highlighted the complex considerations involved in their decision-making process. The collection's governance structure required them to balance respect for royal authority with their responsibilities to protect Diana's legacy and maintain public confidence in their stewardship. Lady Thornton attempted to address the practical considerations that made the current situation different from normal circumstances. Board members, perhaps I could emphasize the compressed timeline involved. The Danish state visit was confirmed only recently, and normal advance planning procedures were not possible given the diplomatic circumstances. However, Professor Ashworth's response suggested that practical considerations, while important, could not override the fundamental principles underlying the collection's governance. Lady Thornton, while we sympathize with the scheduling challenges, the board's responsibilities require us to consider long-term implications rather than immediate convenience. As the consultation continued, it became clear that the board members were genuinely wrestling with competing loyalties and responsibilities. Their commitment to Diana's legacy was absolute, but they also recognized their obligations to the broader monarchy and the constitutional questions raised by the current situation. Lord Spencer's position was particularly complex, as he needed to balance his role as Diana's brother with his responsibilities as a board member. His words carried special weight due to his family connection, but that same connection created potential conflicts of interest that complicated his decision-making process. I think we need to consider not just the immediate circumstances but the precedent this decision will establish, he said thoughtfully. The collection's independence has been carefully maintained since its establishment. Any compromise of that independence could have far-reaching consequences for future situations. Dr. Mitchell raised additional concerns about the practical aspects of emergency authorization. Even if we were to approve this request, the proper handling and security procedures for the item's removal from the palace would require additional time and coordination. The consultation had been ongoing for nearly 40 minutes, and the complexity of the issues involved was becoming increasingly apparent. The board members were clearly taking their responsibilities seriously, but their deliberations were extending the delay in Camilla's schedule and adding pressure to the evening's preparations. Captain Whitmore, who had remained silently present throughout the consultation, finally spoke to address the security and practical considerations involved. Board members, I can confirm that appropriate security arrangements for the item's transport and handling are already in place. The delay is purely administrative rather than logistical. This confirmation removed one potential obstacle to approval, but the fundamental constitutional and procedural questions remained unresolved. The board members continued their careful deliberation, weighing competing considerations that had no clear precedent in royal history. The morning sun had shifted position during the consultation, casting different shadows through the drawing room windows, as the discussion continued to evolve around questions of authority, tradition, and the delicate balance required to maintain both royal effectiveness and institutional integrity. As the consultation entered its final phase, the tension in the blue drawing room had reached a crescendo that seemed to press against the walls of the elegant space. The three board members visible on the video screens appeared to be engaged in careful deliberation, their expressions reflecting the gravity of the decision they were being asked to make. Professor Ashworth leaned forward in her Oxford office, her academic demeanor conveying the weight of constitutional precedent that informed her thinking. "Colleagues, I believe we must consider the long-term implications of our decision today. The Diana Memorial Collection's independence has been a cornerstone of its credibility and public trust. Lord Spencer's image showed him in deep contemplation, surrounded by the family photographs that served as constant reminders of his personal investment in the collection's purpose. I find myself torn between respect for the Queen Consort's position and my responsibility to protect my sister's legacy from potential controversy." Dr. Mitchell maintained her professional composure, while clearly struggling with the practical implications of various possible decisions. "The precedent we establish today will influence how the collection operates for decades to come. We cannot allow immediate convenience to override fundamental principles." Camilla listened to these deliberations with growing awareness that the board members were genuinely committed to their responsibilities, even when those responsibilities created conflict with royal authority. The jewelry case, which had started the morning as a simple accessory for a state dinner, had become the focal point of a constitutional crisis that would reshape the relationship between royal prerogative and institutional governance. Lady Thornton checked her watch discreetly, aware that time was becoming an increasingly critical factor. The Danish delegation would arrive in less than 4 hours, and Camilla's preparation schedule was becoming critically compressed. The practical implications of further delay were adding additional pressure to an already complex situation. "Board members," she interjected diplomatically, "I wonder if we might consider the specific circumstances of tonight's state dinner. The diplomatic importance of proper ceremonial presentation extends beyond personal preference to matters of national representation." Professor Ashworth nodded thoughtfully. "Lady Thornton raises an important point about the ceremonial obligations of the monarchy. However, the question remains whether those obligations justify deviation from the collection's established governance procedures. At this critical juncture, an unexpected development changed the entire dynamic of the consultation. The private secretary to King Charles appeared in the drawing room doorway with an expression of urgent purpose that immediately captured everyone's attention. "Your Majesty," he said with appropriate deference to Camilla, "His Majesty the King has concluded his meeting with the Prime Minister and requests an immediate private audience regarding this matter." The announcement created a moment of electric silence as everyone present absorbed the implications of direct royal intervention in the consultation process. Charles's involvement would bring the full authority of the crown to bear on the situation, potentially overriding the complex institutional considerations that had dominated the discussion. Camilla felt a mixture of relief and apprehension at her husband's intervention. While his support would certainly resolve the immediate crisis, the public nature of the confrontation and the institutional questions it had raised would likely continue to reverberate through royal circles for months to come. Lord Pemberton immediately recognized the constitutional significance of the King's intervention. "Board members, we have a new development that requires immediate consideration. His Majesty the King is prepared to address this matter directly." The board members' reactions were visible even through the video conference technology. Professor Ashworth's academic composure gave way to obvious concern about the constitutional implications of direct royal pressure on their independent decision-making process. "Lord Pemberton," she said carefully, "while we certainly respect His Majesty's authority, the collection's governance structure was specifically designed to maintain independence from direct royal influence. This principle is fundamental to our credibility." Lord Spencer's position was particularly complex, as his family connection to both Diana and the current royal family created competing loyalties that the consultation had brought into sharp focus. "I believe we must complete our deliberations before any additional interventions, regardless of their source." Dr. Mitchell supported this position from her museum perspective. The integrity of our decision-making process requires that we reach our conclusion based on the established criteria rather than external pressure. However, the practical reality of royal authority could not be ignored indefinitely. Captain Whitmore, who had maintained his vigil over the jewelry throughout the consultation, finally spoke to address the constitutional questions that had become central to the discussion. With respect to all parties, he said with military directness, the fundamental issue remains the competing authorities involved in this situation. The Diana Memorial Collection operates under royal charter, but that charter was established by the same crown that is now seeking access to the collection. His observation highlighted the circular nature of the constitutional questions involved. The collection's authority derived ultimately from royal charter, creating a paradoxical situation where royal authority was being used to limit royal authority. Professor Ashworth seized upon this constitutional complexity. Captain Whitmore has identified the central paradox we face. The collection's independence exists by royal grace, but that independence must be meaningful to serve its intended purpose. As this discussion continued, Charles himself appeared in the doorway of the blue drawing room, his presence immediately transforming the entire dynamic of the consultation. The king's arrival brought the full weight of royal authority to bear on a situation that had already tested the limits of constitutional precedent. "Board members," he said, acknowledging the video conference participants with appropriate courtesy, "I appreciate your dedication to preserving my first wife's legacy. However, I believe the current situation requires direct royal clarification." His words carried the unmistakable authority of the crown while maintaining diplomatic respect for the board's position and responsibilities. The careful balance of his language reflected years of experience in managing complex constitutional relationships. Lord Spencer responded immediately to his former brother-in-law's intervention. "Your Majesty, we are committed to reaching a decision based on the collection's established principles. We hope you understand that our independence serves the broader interests of the monarchy." Charles nodded thoughtfully. "Lord Spencer, I have the greatest respect for your family's commitment to Diana's memory and for the board's important work. However, tonight's state dinner represents a significant diplomatic occasion that requires appropriate ceremonial support." Professor Ashworth maintained her academic perspective despite the increased pressure. "Your Majesty, while we acknowledge the importance of tonight's event, the collection's protocols exist to prevent exactly this kind of emergency situation from compromising our decision-making process." The king's response revealed the depth of his understanding of the constitutional complexities involved. "Professor Ashworth, I appreciate your commitment to proper procedures. However, I must point out that the monarchy's effectiveness in fulfilling its ceremonial and diplomatic obligations depends on reasonable access to appropriate regalia." Dr. Mitchell attempted to find middle ground that might address both perspectives. "Your Majesty, perhaps we could approve this specific request while establishing clearer procedures for future emergency situations." This suggestion offered a potential path toward resolution that might satisfy all parties while avoiding the precedential problems that had complicated the discussion. However, it also required acknowledgement from all sides that the current governance structure needed modification. Charles considered the proposal carefully before responding. "Dr. Mitchell, I believe your suggestion has merit. The current situation has revealed gaps in our procedures that should be addressed through careful consultation rather than emergency decision-making." Camilla, who had remained largely silent during her husband's intervention, finally spoke to address the personal implications of the morning's events. "I hope everyone understands that my request was made in good faith and with genuine respect for Princess Diana's memory. The suggestion that I would treat her legacy carelessly is deeply hurtful." Her words carried emotional weight that seemed to affect all participants in the consultation. The morning's confrontation had created personal tensions alongside the institutional questions, and resolution would require healing both types of wounds. Lord Spencer responded to her statement with obvious sincerity. "Your Majesty, I don't believe anyone questions your respect for my sister's memory. The protocols exist not to impugn anyone's motives, but to ensure that good intentions are supported by appropriate procedures." Professor Ashworth finally offered the board's decision after nearly 2 hours of consultation and deliberation. "In light of the extraordinary circumstances and His Majesty's direct intervention, the board will approve this specific request. However, We strongly recommend immediate review of the collection's governance procedures to prevent similar conflicts in the future. The announcement brought visible relief to everyone in the drawing room, though the underlying institutional questions remained unresolved. Camilla would be able to wear Diana's Sapphire set to the state dinner, but the morning's confrontation had exposed fundamental tensions that would require ongoing attention. Captain Whitmore finally relinquished his careful guard over the jewelry case, formally transferring custody to Camilla with the appropriate documentation now properly completed. His military bearing remained unchanged, though those familiar with his character might have detected a slight relaxation in his posture. As the consultation concluded and the various participants began to disperse, the implications of the morning's events continued to resonate through the palace corridors. The confrontation had tested constitutional principles, personal relationships, and institutional loyalties in ways that would influence royal operations for years to come. The jewelry case in Camilla's hands contained more than precious stones and metals. It now carried the weight of precedent and the complex legacy of institutional change. The morning's crisis had been resolved, but the underlying questions about authority, tradition, and the balance between respect for the past and the needs of the present remained as relevant as ever. The Danish delegation would arrive as scheduled, and the state dinner would proceed with appropriate ceremony and dignity. However, the sapphire set that Camilla would wear would carry additional significance as a symbol of the ongoing evolution of the British monarchy and its continued ability to adapt to changing circumstances while maintaining its essential character and traditions. The confrontation that had begun as a simple disagreement about jewelry protocols had evolved into a defining moment in the relationship between royal authority and institutional governance, establishing precedents that would influence the monarchy's operation for generations to come.